Number 1. The Cynocephali. Imagine reading the work of a respected historian, a man whose accounts of wars and kings are still studied today, and finding him calmly insist that somewhere at the edge of the world lives a race of people with the heads of dogs. This is not a fairy tale. This is Herodotus, writing in his Histories around 440 BC, placing dog-headed men in the deserts of western Libya. The Greeks even had a precise word for them. They called them the Cynocephaloi, which means, quite literally, the dog-headed ones. And Herodotus was far from alone. A Greek physician named Ctesias of Cnidus, who served at the Persian court around 400 BC, described these creatures in even greater detail. He claimed there were 120,000 of them living in the mountains of India. They could not speak, he wrote. Instead, they barked. They wore the skins of wild animals and lived by hunting. A century later, Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador to the Indian court, repeated the same reports almost word for word. So what were these ancient writers actually seeing? The answer is an animal you can visit in a zoo today. The Hamadryas baboon, Papio hamadryas, has a long, distinctly dog-like muzzle, and when it sits upright, it looks unsettlingly human. These baboons live across the Horn of Africa and the southwestern corner of Arabia, exactly the distant trade frontiers where Greek and Roman writers placed their dogmen. The adult males grow a thick silver-gray cape of hair across their shoulders, giving them the appearance of a wild, robed man. And they do not speak. They bark, exactly as Ctesias described. Travelers passing through these regions would have heard second-hand accounts of barking, dog-faced beings that moved in groups hundreds strong, and those accounts hardened, over centuries, into ethnography. The Egyptians knew these animals intimately. They considered the baboon sacred, linking it to Thoth, the god of writing and wisdom, and they depicted it sitting upright in a pose that looks almost like prayer. The Egyptian deity Hapi, one of the four sons of Horus, was even shown with a baboon head. Pliny the Elder cataloged the dog-headed people as a genuine race in his Natural History, around 77 AD, and from there, the legend traveled into the Middle Ages. Cynocephali appear on the Great Hereford World Map of around 1300, fixed at the edge of the known Earth. There is even an Eastern Orthodox tradition that depicts Saint Christopher himself as dog-headed. The mainstream explanation is simple misidentification of baboons. Others suggest a blend of baboon sightings with descriptions of unfamiliar foreign peoples. A fringe few still wonder about a lost branch of humanity. But if a known animal could become a monstrous race, what could a buried fossil become? Number 2. The Griffin. The Griffin has guarded the imagination of the West for nearly 3,000 years. It has the body of a lion, and the head, beak, and wings of an eagle, and in the oldest Greek accounts, it crouches over hoards of gold in the mountains of the distant east. For most of history, this was assumed to be pure invention. Then, in the 1990s, a classical folklorist named Adrienne Mayer proposed something remarkable, an idea she laid out fully in her 2000 book, The First Fossil Hunters. The griffin, she argued, was inspired by a real animal, but one that had been dead for 80 million years. That animal was Protoceratops andrewsi, a beaked, four-legged dinosaur about the size of a large dog. Protoceratops fossils are extraordinarily abundant in the Gobi Desert of Mongolia and the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains. They erode out of the red sandstone in near-complete, lifelike poses, and the first thing a traveler would notice is the prominent, eagle-like beak on the skull. The bony frill around the neck, when weathered and broken, can look like folded wings or pointed ears. Crucially, the very regions where these fossils litter the ground were the gold mining territories of the Scythians and other nomadic peoples. The Greek explorer Aristeas of Proconnesus, writing in the 7th century BC and quoted later by Herodotus, described griffins guarding gold in exactly that northern and eastern wilderness. The match goes deeper. Greek lore said griffins built their nests on the ground, And Protoceratops fossils are often found alongside their nests of eggs, lying exposed at the surface. Those very eggs, discovered by the Roy Chapman Andrews expeditions in the 1920s, were among the first dinosaur eggs ever scientifically recognized. A full-grown Protoceratops stretched about 1.8 meters long and weighed around 180 kilograms, roughly the mass of a lion, and it walked on 4 sturdy legs, just like the lion-bodied Griffin of myth. Not everyone agrees. Paleontologist Paul Barrett and others point out that Griffin imagery appears in Near Eastern and Minoan art long before the Greeks could have reached the Gobi, suggesting the creature began as an artistic motif. Perhaps the fossils reinforced an image that already existed. Either way, Mayer's work founded an entire discipline called geomythology, the study of how real geological features generate legends. And the next legend is a bird so large it was said to carry off elephants. Number 3. The Rock. In the Voyages of Sinbad, told within the 1001 Nights, the hero is stranded on a remote island where the sky suddenly darkens. A bird so enormous it blots out the sun descends to its nest, a creature the storytellers called the Rock, or Rook, said to be powerful enough to snatch a fully grown elephant from the ground. Marco Polo himself reported tales of a giant bird on islands south of Madagascar, large enough to seize an elephant in its talons. For centuries this was dismissed as the tallest of tall tales, but Madagascar was hiding something. The island was once home to the elephant bird, a family of giant flightless birds called the Aepyornithidae. The most famous species, Aepyornis maximus, stood up to 3 meters tall, that is nearly 10 feet. In 2018, a paleontologist named James Hansford of the Zoological Society of London formally named an even larger member, Varambe titan, which may have weighed up to 730 kilograms. That makes it the heaviest bird that has ever lived. Despite their bulk, these birds were not related to ostriches. DNA analysis revealed that their closest living relative is the tiny kiwi of New Zealand, a clue to ancient connections between southern landmasses. But it is the egg that truly explains the legend. An elephant bird egg could reach 34 centimeters in length, with a circumference of about 1 meter and a volume of roughly 9 liters. That is the largest egg of any animal known to science, larger even than the eggs of the dinosaurs. A single one held the equivalent of about 150 chicken eggs. Imagine a trader on the Indian Ocean routes encountering one of these, or stumbling on the massive bones in a Madagascar marsh. The French governor Etienne de Flacourt recorded native accounts of a giant bird in the 1650s, and the species was scientifically named by Isidore Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire in 1851. The elephant bird likely went extinct around 1000 to 1200 AD, possibly surviving even later in remote regions, which means humans and these giants overlapped for a very long time. Cut marks on elephant bird bones suggest people were in Madagascar as early as 10,500 years ago. One pristine egg sold at auction in 2013 for more than 66,000 pounds. The elephant snatching detail was almost certainly exaggeration, born from the literal name and pure awe. But the next giant was not a bird. It had one eye. Number 4. The Cyclops. When Odysseus and his men are trapped in the cave of Polyphemus in Homer's Odyssey, written around the 8th century BC, they face a giant with a single eye set in the middle of its forehead. The Cyclopes were among the most vivid monsters of Greek myth, and for a long time they seemed like the purest fantasy. Then, early 20th century scientists, led by the Austrian paleontologist Othenio Abel, noticed something that is hard to unsee once you know it. The skulls of dwarf elephants look uncannily like the face of a one-eyed giant. During the Pleistocene, Mediterranean islands, including Sicily, Crete, Cyprus, and Malta, were home to dwarf elephant species, such as Paleoloxodon falconeri. Through a process called insular dwarfism, these animals shrank to about 1 meter tall, yet their skulls remained massive relative to a human head, roughly twice the size of ours. And here is the key. An elephant skull has a single large opening in the center of the face, the nasal cavity, where the trunk attaches. To anyone who had never seen a living elephant, that central hole reads instantly as one enormous eye socket. The animal's actual eye sockets are small and tucked far to the sides, easily overlooked. Place that skull in the hands of an ancient Sicilian shepherd with no concept of elephants, and you have the skull of a giant with a single eye. The geography fits perfectly. Sicily and the surrounding islands are exactly where Homer and later Greek writers located the Cyclops. Adrienne Mayer expanded this case in her work on Greek fossil folklore, placing it alongside the Griffin as a founding example of geomythology. The Greeks had no framework for extinct animals, so when they unearthed enormous bones and skulls in island caves, the only available explanation was a race of vanished giants. They even credited the Cyclops with building the colossal stone walls of Mycenae and Sirens, masonry so massive that later Greeks could not imagine human hands had stacked it, and so they called it Cyclopean. The thinker Empedocles speculated about giant bones, an early flicker of paleontological curiosity. The same island dwarfism that shrank these elephants also produced dwarf hippos and dwarf deer, so the caves of Sicily and Crete were full of strange, miniature versions of familiar animals alongside their giant-looking skulls. Today, museums make the case vividly by placing a dwarf elephant skull right next to a human skull, so visitors can see the false eye socket for themselves. There are competing readings, of course. Some scholars link the single eye to the forge of a blacksmith. A few still imagine literal one-eyed beings. But the dwarf elephant's skull remains the most powerful explanation. A skull made a giant. Could a single horn make a unicorn? Number 5. The Siberian Unicorn. The unicorn is usually filed under fairy tale, a delicate white horse with a spiraling horn. But the real story is stranger and far more ancient, because a genuine single-horned giant once thundered across the plains of Eurasia. Its name was Elasmotherium sibericum, and scientists call it the Siberian Unicorn. This was no graceful horse. It was a rhinoceros, but an enormous one, reaching up to 4.5 meters in length and weighing between 3.5 and 4 tons, larger than a modern white rhino. It was covered in shaggy hair to survive the freezing steppe of Central Asia and Siberia, and on its forehead it carried a single massive horn, which some researchers estimate may have exceeded a meter in length. For decades, this seemed to have nothing to do with human legend, because Elasmotherium was thought to have died out around 200,000 years ago, long before any modern myths could form. Then, the dating was overturned. In 2016, the Russian scientist Andrei Shpansky of Tomsk State University radiocarbon dated a skull to roughly 29,000 years ago. 2 years later, a study published in Nature Ecology and Evolution, led by Pavel Kosintsev and the British paleontologist Adrian Lister, pushed the extinction to around 39,000 years ago. That date is critical because it means Elasmotherium overlapped with modern humans in Eurasia. Early people could have watched this single-horned giant grazing on the tough steppe grasses, and the memory of such a creature could echo down through thousands of years. The horn itself is made of keratin, the same material as your fingernails, so it never fossilizes. Its size is inferred from a large, roughened dome on the skull where it once anchored. The same 2018 genetic study revealed that Elasmotherium split from all other rhinos more than 40 million years ago, making it a deeply ancient and isolated lineage. The classical unicorn of Western tradition drew on other sources too. The physician Ctesias described a one-horned wild ass in India around 400 BC, probably an Indian rhinoceros. Marco Polo later wrote of ugly unicorns in Sumatra that were clearly rhinos wallowing in mud. And in medieval Europe, narwhal tusks were sold as unicorn horns for staggering sums. The throne chair of Denmark was even built using this so-called unicorn ivory. A land beast confirmed by science. Now, to the greatest monster of the sea. Number 6. The Kraken. Off the cold coasts of Norway and Greenland, sailors whispered of a creature so vast it could be mistaken for an island. A beast whose writhing arms could wrap around a ship and drag it beneath the waves. They called it the Kraken. The earliest detailed account comes from Erik Pontoppidan, a bishop who described it in his Natural History of Norway in 1755, claiming the creature was over a mile wide. Even the great naturalist Carl Linnaeus included a cephalopod-like monster called Microcosmus in the first edition of his Systema Naturae in 1735, though he quietly removed it later. For generations, scholars assumed the Kraken was nothing more than the exaggeration of frightened, superstitious sailors. They were wrong. The Kraken was real, and its true name is the giant squid, Archaeoteuthis dux. This animal can reach a total length of around 12 to 13 meters, including its long feeding tentacles. Its relative, the colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthes hamiltoni, is even heavier, weighing up to 500 kilograms and armed with rotating hooks on its arms. For most of history, these creatures were known only from carcasses washed onto beaches and from beaks found in the stomachs of sperm whales. The whales themselves carry the proof of these deep battles, their skin marked with circular scars from giant squid suckers. The Danish zoologist Japetus Steenstrup formally described Archaeoteuthis in 1857, finally giving the legend a scientific name, and the colossal squid was described in 1925 from arm fragments alone. But the true vindication came in this century. In 2004, the Japanese scientists Tsunemi Kubodera and Kyoichi Mori captured the first photographs ever taken of a live giant squid in its natural habitat. Then, in 2012, Kubodera's team filmed a living giant squid in the deep sea near the Ogasawara Islands, the first footage of its kind. In 2019, another giant squid was filmed alive in American waters in the Gulf of Mexico during an expedition called Journey into Midnight. These animals possess the largest eyes in the entire animal kingdom, up to 27 centimeters across, evolved to detect the faintest light in the crushing dark where they live, between 300 and 1,000 meters down. That depth is exactly why they eluded us for so long. Victorian scientists got their first real chances to study the animal during mass strandings, like the wave of giant squid that washed ashore in Newfoundland in the 1870s, providing whole bodies to dissect. More recently, a DNA study in 2013 made a startling discovery that giant squid all over the world form a single, genetically similar global population, as if one connected species haunts every ocean. Tennyson immortalized the beast in his 1830 poem, The Kraken. The monster of the deep was filmed alive, but the land had its own giants. Number 7. Giants and the Nephilim. Almost every culture on Earth tells of a time when giants walked the world. The Hebrew Bible speaks of the Nephilim in the book of Genesis. The Greeks told of the Gigantes who warred against the gods. These stories are so widespread that they demand an explanation, and the explanation is buried in the ground. Across history, people kept digging up enormous bones, and without any concept of extinct animals, they reached the only conclusion that made sense to them. These were the remains of giant humans. The bones belong to Ice Age megafauna, creatures like the woolly mammoth and the American mastodon. A mammoth femur, the thigh bone, can exceed 1.2 meters in length, compared to a human femur of about 45 centimeters. To an untrained eye, it looks exactly like the leg bone of a person scaled up to monstrous size. The ancient Greeks collected such bones and displayed them as the relics of heroes and giants. Adrian Mayer has argued that the bones reverently exhibited as belonging to the heroes Theseus and Orion were in fact fossil megafauna. In 1613, a discovery in France was paraded as the skeleton of a giant named Teutobochus, when it was really the remains of a mastodon or mammoth. Even St. Augustine, writing his City of God around 426 AD, cited a giant tooth he had seen as proof that giants once existed. The Puritan minister Cotton Mather reported giant bones in New York in 1705 that were, again, a mastodon. The man who ended the age of giants was the French naturalist Georges Cuvier. In the early 1800s, Cuvier formally recognized the mastodon, Mammut americanum, as a distinct extinct animal. In doing so, he founded the sciences of extinction and comparative anatomy, proving beyond doubt that these bones belonged to vanished beasts, not to giant people. Before that breakthrough, the confusion ran wild. In 1663, the scientist Otto von Guericke even reconstructed a so-called unicorn skeleton by assembling mammoth and rhinoceros bones into a fantastical creature. And belief in giants was so durable that it fueled deliberate hoaxes, like the famous Cardiff giant of 1869, a carved stone figure passed off as a petrified man. The giants were real bones. They simply were not human ones, which raises the question of whether a giant ape could be real. Number 8. The Yeti. High in the Himalayas, the people of Nepal and Tibet have long told of a massive ape-like creature that walks upright through the snow. The being the West came to call the abominable snowman, or Yeti. The Yeti has two real anchors in science, and the first is genuinely astonishing. A giant ape really did exist in Asia. Its name is Gigantopithecus blacki, and it is the largest primate ever known to have lived. It was identified in 1935 by the paleontologist Gustav von Königswald, who found his first specimen, a single enormous molar, for sale in a Hong Kong apothecary shop, where it was being sold as a dragon bone. That detail is more than a curiosity, because the fossil teeth of Gigantopithecus were traded for centuries in Chinese medicine markets, precisely as dragon bones, feeding directly into legends of dragons and monsters. Gigantopithecus is known mainly from thousands of teeth and a handful of jawbones found in caves across southern China, Vietnam, and India. From these, scientists estimate the animal stood up to 3 meters tall and weighed as much as 300 kilograms, dwarfing a modern gorilla. In 2019, a protein analysis led by Frito Welker placed it as a close relative of the modern orangutan. A study published in Nature in 2024 dated its extinction to between roughly 295,000 and 215,000 years ago, when environmental change outpaced its ability to adapt its diet of fruit and fibrous plants. So a real giant ape once lived in exactly the part of the world the Yeti is said to haunt. But what about modern sightings? Here the second anchor appears. In 2017, the biologist Charlotte Lindqvist of the University at Buffalo analyzed the DNA of samples claimed to come from Yetis. They turned out to belong to Himalayan brown bears, Asian black bears, and, in one case, a dog. The legendary mountaineer Reinhold Messner, after years of personal investigation, concluded the Yeti was simply the Himalayan brown bear, which can stand and walk on 2 legs. The famous giant footprints photographed by Eric Shipton on the Menlung Glacier in 1951 can be explained by tracks that melt and refreeze in the sun, growing larger and stranger. A revered Yeti scalp kept at Kumjung Monastery was shown to be made from the hide of a sero, a goat antelope. The Tibetan blue bear is another strong candidate behind the sightings, and Sherpa folklore itself actually distinguishes several different kinds of Yeti, some of which clearly correspond to known bears. It was the founder of cryptozoology, Bernard Heuvelmans, who first popularized the theory that a surviving population of Gigantopithecus might explain the Yeti and its American cousin, Bigfoot, though no shred of physical evidence has ever supported a living giant ape. A beast man with a real fossil ancestor. Now, to a creature that was half man and half bull. Number 9. The Minotaur. The Minotaur is one of the most terrifying figures in Greek myth, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, hidden at the heart of a vast labyrinth beneath the palace of King Minos on the island of Crete. Every 9 years, according to the legend, young Athenians were sent into the maze as sacrifices, never to return. This sounds like pure fantasy until you stand in the ruins of Knossos. Beginning in 1900, the British archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated a sprawling Bronze Age palace on Crete, a structure so large and so bewilderingly complex that it has been linked to the labyrinth ever since. The palace covered around 20,000 square meters and may have contained as many as 1,300 interconnected rooms across multiple stories. To a visitor from a simpler society, it would have felt like a maze with no exit. Evans named the lost civilization Minoan, after the legendary king Minos, and what he uncovered grounded the bull-headed monster in something real. The Minoans were obsessed with bulls. The walls of Knossos are decorated with vivid frescoes of bull leaping, a ritual sport in which athletes vaulted over the horns of charging bulls. Archaeologists have unearthed numerous bull-shaped ritual vessels, including a famous carved stone bull's head ritten from Knossos itself. Sacred architecture across the site features the so-called horns of consecration, stylized bull horns. The double axe, called the labris, appears everywhere, and many scholars believe the word labyrinth originally meant the house of the double axe. So the bull man of myth grows out of a real, bull-worshipping palace culture, where bull sacrifice and perhaps masked rituals could easily have inspired the image of a creature that was part human, part bull. The myth of Athenian youths sent as tribute may even preserve a memory of real Cretan political dominance over the cities of the Aegean. The Minoan civilization flourished from around 2000 BC until roughly 1450 BC, when it declined, possibly weakened by the catastrophic eruption of the Thera volcano around 1600 BC, and later absorbed by the mainland Mycenaeans. The labyrinth motif was so central to the city that it was later stamped onto the coins of Knossos, preserving the maze in metal for centuries. Evans's reconstructions, rebuilt in concrete and bright paint, remain controversial, and the Minoan script known as Linear A is still undeciphered. So much of their religion stays mysterious. A real place behind a monster. And finally, the most romantic legend of the sea. Number 10. Mermaids and the Sirens. Of all the creatures on this list, the mermaid may be the most beloved, the half-woman, half-fish being who lures sailors with her song, descended in part from the sirens of Greek myth. And of all these creatures, the mermaid has the most undeniable proof of a real-world origin, because science has literally named an entire order of mammals after her. The order Sirenia, which includes the manatees and the dugongs, takes its name directly from the sirens, in honor of the countless sailors who mistook these animals for mermaids. It is easy to see how the confusion happened. Manatees and dugongs are large, gentle aquatic mammals that must surface to breathe. They nurse their young while floating upright in the water, cradling the calf, and from a distance this looks startlingly like a human figure rising from the sea. The females even have mammary glands located on the chest, near what would be the armpits, giving a vaguely human shape to a tired sailor's distant glance. The dugong in particular has a fluked horizontal tail that looks remarkably like the classic mermaid's tail, while the manatee has a rounded paddle. The most famous sighting of all belongs to Christopher Columbus, who recorded seeing 3 mermaids off the coast of Hispaniola on the 9th of January, 1493. He noted, with some disappointment, that they were not as beautiful as they are painted. He had almost certainly seen manatees. These animals appear exactly where the legends cluster. Dugongs live in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, the cradle of much early mermaid and siren lore, while manatees inhabit the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Amazon, matching mermaid reports from the New World. Interestingly, the Greek sirens were originally depicted as bird women, and only merged with the fish-tailed mermaid image during the medieval period. Such sightings were reported for centuries. The crew of the explorer Henry Hudson recorded spotting a mermaid in Arctic waters in 1608, and ancient writers like Aristotle and Pliny the Elder discussed sea creatures and tritons as they tried to catalog the strange things sailors brought home. The family could grow truly enormous. Steller's sea cow, a giant relative discovered in 1741, reached up to 9 meters in length before being hunted to extinction by 1768. The legend was also exploited by hoaxers, most famously the Fiji mermaid that P.T. Barnum exhibited in 1842, stitched together from a monkey and a fish. But the truth needs no stitching. The origin of the mermaid is embedded forever in a scientific name. Step back from the individual creatures, and a clear pattern emerges, a kind of machinery that turns real animals into monsters. There are 3 engines at work across every one of these legends. The first is the misidentification of a living animal, seen briefly or from a distance. The dog-headed men were baboons, the Kraken was a giant squid, the mermaid was a manatee or dugong, and many modern Yeti sightings were Himalayan bears. The second engine is the misinterpretation of fossils. The Griffin came from Protoceratops, the Cyclops from dwarf elephant skulls, the giants from mammoths and mastodons, and the Yeti's deep ancestor was the genuine giant ape Gigantopithecus. The third engine is exaggeration through distance and retelling, where each storyteller adds a little more, until a large bird becomes a creature that carries elephants. Trade routes turn out to be essential to this process. The Scythian gold roads carried griffin tails out of the Gobi. The Indian Ocean routes spread accounts of giant birds and mermaids. The Silk Road moved fossil dragon bones from Chinese caves into medicine markets and into legend. And underlying all of it is one crucial absence. Before the work of Cuvier in the early 1800s, humanity had no concept of extinction. There was no mental category for an animal that no longer existed. So when ancient people unearthed a strange skull or a colossal bone, they could not say, "This is an extinct species." They could only say, "This is a giant, a dragon, a one-eyed monster." Certain features triggered the monster-making instinct again and again. A prominent beak, a single horn, a central hole in a skull, or simply enormous size. The discipline that studies all of this, founded largely by Adrienne Mayer, is called geomythology, and it treats myth not as fantasy, but as data, a distorted record of real observations waiting to be decoded. Behind every one of these revelations stands a researcher who refused to dismiss the old stories. Adrienne Mayer reshaped the entire field, drawing the lines from the Griffin to Protoceratops and from the Cyclops to the dwarf elephant, and giving the study of these connections its name. Before her, the Austrian paleontologist Othenio Abel had already proposed that elephant skulls inspired the one-eyed giants. Georges Cuvier, working 2 centuries ago, gave us the concept of extinction itself, the single idea that made it possible to reinterpret giant bones as vanished animals rather than vanished people. In the oceans, the Danish zoologist Japetus Steenstrup gave the Kraken its scientific identity in 1857, and more than a century later, the Japanese scientist Tsunemi Kubodera finally photographed and then filmed a living giant squid. On Madagascar, James Hansford named the heaviest bird ever known and traced the early presence of humans on the island. The redating of the Siberian Unicorn was the work of researchers including Andrei Spansky, Pavel Kosintsev, and Adrian Leister, who together pulled Elasmotherium forward into the human era. Gustav von Königswald rescued a giant ape from an apothecary's shelf, and decades later, Frida Welker used ancient proteins to reveal its family tree, while Charlotte Lindqvist used DNA to expose the true source of Yeti relics. And Arthur Evans, for all the controversy of his methods, pulled an entire lost civilization out of the Cretan soil. What unites them is a method, modern dating, DNA sequencing, and protein analysis keep redrawing the line between myth and reality. And that line has moved again and again in favor of the old stories. There is a humbling lesson tucked inside these stories, because skepticism, for all its value, has sometimes been wrong. The giant squid was dismissed as the fantasy of drunken sailors for centuries before Steenstrup forced science to take it seriously. The gorilla, an animal we now know intimately, was considered a legend until it was formally described in 1847. The platypus was thought to be a hoax when the first specimen reached England, with naturalists searching for the stitches. The Komodo dragon was rumored for years before its confirmation in 1910. Each of these was once filed under myth, and each turned out to be entirely real. The most dramatic example of all is the coelacanth, a fish known only from fossils and assumed to have died out with the dinosaurs, until a living one was hauled up off the coast of South Africa in 1938. A creature literally classified as extinct was swimming in the sea the whole time. These cases cut against the easy confidence of dismissal. At the same time, belief without evidence has its own dangers, and the history of these legends is littered with deliberate frauds. The Cardiff Giant of 1869, the Fiji Mermaid of 1842, and various faked Yeti relics all exploited the public hunger to believe. The challenge is to hold two truths at once. Extraordinary claims do require strong evidence, but the absence of evidence today is not proof that something never existed. The honest scientist keeps the door open, and each confirmed creature recalibrates exactly how far open that door should be. Not every legend has been solved, and the frontier where folklore meets science is still active. Dragons remain the great puzzle, a worldwide motif that may blend memories of crocodiles, large snakes, and the fossil dragon bones of Asia, yet no single explanation fully accounts for how similar dragon imagery arose on every continent. The thunderbird of North American traditions may preserve a memory of large raptors or the fossils of pterosaurs. In Australia, the fearsome bunyip has been tentatively linked to the bones of Diprotodon, a giant extinct marsupial that early Aboriginal peoples would have encountered. Tales of sea serpents may owe something to the strange ribbon-like oarfish, which can grow many meters long, or to the decomposing carcasses of whales. Other cases remain stubbornly open. The Moklem Bembe of the Congo Basin draws expedition after expedition, but has never yielded physical proof, marking the outer limit of legitimate inquiry and the beginning of wishful thinking. Whether any Yeti or Bigfoot sighting will ever produce a body or a verifiable bone is, for now, an open question, and the scientific consensus leans firmly toward no. Even at Knossos, the Minoan script called Linear A remains undeciphered, which means a large part of the very religion that produced the Minotaur is still unreadable. And new fossil dating, of the kind that pulled Elasmotherium and Gigantopithecus into more recent times, could yet reveal that other creatures overlapped with humans far more recently than we assume. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but it is not proof of existence either, and that tension is exactly where the next discoveries will be made. What ties all 10 of these creatures together is a single, quietly revolutionary idea. Every one of them began as a real observation, honestly reported by someone who saw something they could not fully explain. A shepherd holding a skull with a hole in the middle. A trader cradling an egg the size of a melon. A sailor watching a gentle shape rise from the water to breathe. Myth, in this light, is not the opposite of truth. It is a storage medium, a way of carrying a real memory of the natural world across hundreds of generations, encoded in story, because story is what people could remember. This reframes the relationship between our ancestors and ourselves. They were not inventing fantasies out of nothing. They were doing their best to record a world full of animals they had no science to classify, and they passed that record forward in the only language they had. When we finally match the Griffin to its dinosaur, or the unicorn to its rhino, or the mermaid to her manatee. We are not debunking the past. We are completing it. We are reading our ancestors' field notes with better instruments. There is a real humility in that, and a real wonder. The line that separates a monster from an animal turns out to be made almost entirely of knowledge, and as our knowledge grows, that line keeps dissolving. The creatures, it turns out, were real all along. The only thing missing was our understanding,